Today we're talking about art that I think is overrated. So I will talk about a number of artists who will sort of be emblematic of different ways that I think art can be overrated. But before we talk about that, I think it's important to know where ratings that I'm thinking of come from so you can make your own ratings in an educated way. So one of the things that when I post anything that is not realism, photorealism, a lot of people say that's just not art. I will tell you, everything I show here, I'm not contesting if it's art. I think that we have to be much more open to more things being art. You have to remember the things I'm showing you are some of the most idiosyncratic things, right? Some of the things that are really hard to understand. They're hard to understand on purpose. It doesn't make them not art because you don't get it. And that's okay, right? It's okay that there's art you don't get. It's still art. I think somebody who commented, I wish I had their handle because I think this is a really astute point, is that in childhood we take art class and people say to us, oh, that looks so realistic. So our perception is that the measuring tape for good art is realism. But that's actually never been the measuring stick for good art. Photorealism isn't even like the most popular art movement. Realism even was always about being editorial. So making it look realistic might feel good for you, but in terms of the art world, what they're looking for, and this has always been true, long before the 20th century, it's about telling a point of view and having a style that is attributable to you. And so, Caravaggio, whoever made the Venus of Willendorf, they're always trying to make something that moves people. And so realism has never really been the point in actual art. It can be for you to feel good about yourself in the same way that you might feel good that you wrote an essay that communicates something and follows the five paragraph essay format. Once you learn that 5-paragraph essay format, if you were going to go on to become a journalist, you would break from that. And similarly, an artist, once they figure out how to do realism, will break from that to make something that is their own vision. And that's the other huge thing about art. Good art should be able to communicate a vision to the viewer, and the viewer should feel something. Art is about a reaction. Now, I say that a lot on this channel, and people get real angry because they think reaction is a negative word. I don't mean that. That reaction can be, oh, that's beautiful. That reaction can be, I don't get it. I mean, actually, confounding people can be a positive reaction for an artist. That reaction can be, I understand the story. There's lots of things that are reactions. But if you look at it and you only go, that's not good. Or even worse, a lot of realism does that. If you just look at it and you say it's real and you do not understand the meaning, that artwork actually failed, no matter how realistic it is. Finally, in terms of rating art, I am rating it in terms of what I think is, in terms of art history. So the things that I think will be 200 years from now valuable and important. Part of the challenge is art history and the art market are not the same thing. So collectors will collect things because they want it to stay up in value. And a few of the artists I'll show are artists who are very well known. And certain periods of their artwork I just think aren't that great. They're overrated. And part of these ratings or like the way that the art world works is that they have to, once somebody is famous, often their works continue to increase in value. So even late Picasso or Dali will be valuable for their name. So so in summary, that one, realism isn't the most important. Two, it's about trying to understand the artist's vision, and if they do that well, and if they're communicating and getting a reaction from viewers and they're doing that well, and then remembering that the art world, like the art market, so the selling and buying of art and art history are totally different. So those are the caveats. Now, I haven't spilled any tea on the things I don't think are good. So let's move on to that. So Picasso is definitely one of the ones I think is overrated. Now, I'm showing you a really late stage Picasso. I do think those are like not very interesting to me. He talks a lot about in his later life. He did not have dementia. commenters often ask me that. He did not. He was very cognitively strong till the end. And in his later life, he was trying to draw like a child, which is fine. I do think the works aren't terribly interesting to me. They don't sort of break any rules, which is to me a really important part of making art, breaking the rules. But that's actually not the part that I would say is overrated about Picasso. So Picasso really, I mean, he was a classically trained artist. His father had been an art teacher, and I think he has some real moments of quite interesting work. So, for example, he spends all this time early in his career kind of breaking down ideas, like the saltimbanques is an image that he has, and it shows people who are on the outskirts of society. And he creates these compositions that are a little bit tense, like, where is everyone looking? Why is this person over to the side? Where the hell are they? And all of that confusion was really cutting edge at the time. And he parlays that into works like the Demoiselles d'Avignon. And I do think that this was really cutting edge. He took that idea of trying to add tension and confusion. You know, art until now, a lot of it was meant to be somewhat decorative. And so to create this kind of confusion visually and also to break from realism was interesting. He was certainly not the only person who was doing it, but it was interesting. And I think that this is something that was a major benchmark in art that changed how people thought. Again, not the only person who was doing it, but I think this is an important point where art changed. But it's important to remember, and this is the one of the parts that makes me think that Picasso is overrated. He was always soaking up the ideas other people around him had, putting them into his art. He did this with Matisse, and he did this with Braque. So Picasso did one of these artworks. Can you tell which one? I'll tell you. If I didn't know, I wouldn't know. Well, I mean, there's certain hallmarks that I think are more Picasso than Braque, but Georges Braque comes up with analytical cubism with Picasso, maybe? And Braque is the one over here, and this is Picasso, and they work very closely together. The Picasso gets basically the praise, and that's one of the things I think that's very overrated about Picasso. He was really good at stealing ideas from people and then making them his own. And he was a great salesman for himself. Now, analytical cubism is basically this idea that we can never understand space. Right? Like, if you had a camera, it flattens space. If you're looking with your eyes, you're only seeing one angle. So how do you try to understand the whole picture of something in a flat plane? And so basically it would be like taking a cereal box and splitting it down the side and flattening it out. That's like the only way you could see all the parts of the cereal box at once. And so that's sort of what they're getting at. How do you do that? How do you analyze the space that we live in? And I think that is an interesting idea, right? Like, you'll never, I mean, I think that's something that's so fascinating about the world. You will never see all of it. In one vantage point, you just cannot. And that's like a very thoughtful idea that Braque and Picasso came up with. But here's where I think Picasso's a little overrated. He usually gets all the credit for Cubism when Braque also deserves it. So that's one reason I think Picasso's overrated. The other thing is that Picasso then continued to parlay his success and take ideas from people. This is Dora Maar, his once lover and somebody who he very much wronged. I could do a whole video on the misogyny of Picasso, but that is not why he's overrated. I think that what happens is, and this happens to a lot of artists, you could name a lot of artists who are like this. They get initial success and they do something really interesting and exciting, but then for collectors, they need him to keep making things. Now, I will say that one thing that is great and not overrated about Picasso is that he consistently reinvented himself, and I think that is very strong. But very often, the works he was making in these other periods, because he was Picasso by that point, so he could do whatever. You know, he did ceramics, he did jewelry, he did all kinds of stuff. And that inventiveness is great. But I would guess if we could resurrect Picasso, he would say that some of these works from these periods were overrated. And man, the guy had a big ego. But even he, I think, would say that not all his works were equally good. And that's the other challenge with these big name artists. The people, because it's a Picasso, they think it's good. But he was incredibly prolific, and I don't think he thought all of the Picassos were great. I think he even probably thought some of them were overrated. Maybe he didn't say it, because, again, big ego. But a lot of artists who worked a long time, who are very prolific, would create works of unequal quality. And so when we decide that because it's Picasso, it's good, that means that we get these things that are overrated. And so if you're looking at a Picasso, you should think, is this a good painting? Just because it's Picasso doesn't mean it's good. So the third category of way overrated is the theoretical overrated. Basically, these are the people who talk a big game. Now, I will tell you that while probably there was a lot of theoretical overrated folks in the past, it's harder to feel annoyed with them as compared to the ones who live in our contemporary life. So Julian Schnabel is a contemporary artist. He's a baby boomer. And he is like the poster child for me. I find his work so annoying because his theory, it's basically a crap painting that he has overestimated by the things he said about it. But I feel like that about all of them. Like if I ever saw Julian Schnabel in real life, I would tell him that too. It's not like I'm talking behind his back. Not that he's ever going to know that I exist or watch this video, but that's neither here nor there. To me, the problem is if your theory and what you make don't match up, I don't freaking care. It doesn't matter to me. You know, like we talked about Cubism. I do think Cubism is interesting. The idea that you can't see all of anything ever is fascinating to me. That's true. That feels true. Like, I get that. This, So, Renoir also is one of those people whose names you think, hey, it's Renoir, it has to be good. But I think it's a little bit different than Picasso. So, if Picasso had this big name and he reinvented himself and he was willing to push himself into making bad art or art that wasn't as good as some of his early work, Renoir is actually the opposite. So he is somebody who I do think at the beginning of what now is called Impressionism was doing some really interesting stuff. You know, one thing that he did was that he and his friends were living in a new Paris. This was a Paris that was a breakdown in society. So whereas, before you had this very strict breakdown in what classes mix with what classes, a few different changes in the Paris, and if you want to know what those changes are, just comment and I can make a video about what happened in Paris at the end of the 20th century. But basically, there's this breakdown in society, and it allows people who didn't mix before to mix. And so he is showing that. Now, this looks really pretty, but this is actually very, very shocking that these people would be together. And that they would be hanging out and socializing and even knowing each other. And so he's showing that kind of young people's culture. And so now it comes out as being really like candy corn, cutesy, old ladies wear it on scarves. But when it was made, it was much more like very shocking, crazy TikTok. Like this would be like, I don't know. I don't even know if I can come up with something because we don't have that same sense of class. We certainly do have class, but we don't market quite in the same way. I guess this would be like if you saw famous people and regular people on a TikTok in New York, something like that. And so he did this thing. It was very shocking. And he allowed himself to basically make something that looked sketchy instead of polished. Not sketchy in terms of like, not on the up and up, but sketchy in terms of like drawing sketchy. And he did this, and it was really very different than other people. And even the other Impressionists, even though they were painting en plein air, that means painting outdoors, they weren't necessarily doing this kind of reportage or this really look at contemporary society that he was doing. It was pretty amazing. Except for that, he lets success go to his head. Well, maybe. Basically what happens is that he keeps the style part of it. So the thin lines, I always think that he looks like somebody who just got a new colored pencil set and has decided to make really thin lines. He keeps his line quality and his style and his color family, which is what he became, like when people could tell that was a Renoir. So he keeps that part, but he gives up a lot of the story underneath it. And, you know, it's not just that he did that reportage, but it's also that he created these really well thought out compositions. So he's, you know, looking on plein air, but then he's actually planning it. Like, he is actually staging it on the canvas. He's making sure that it looks like there's groups of people talking, and the scene is very complicated, so there's lots to look at. So in his later work, he has very simple compositions, but keeps all the complicated line quality of it. Basically, he sells out. And he keeps the style, and he keeps doing the style over and over and over, and he has the apple seller, and he has the pretty little girl, and the pretty woman, and blah, 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 blah. So he keeps that kind of stuff, but he no longer has the meat of it, the meaning of it. And so it becomes just candy corn, completely boring. And there are definitely artists that I would say are like this. They didn't start out overrated, but then they continued to just make basically the same thing over and over and over and over. And I would say that another person who's like this, so if Picasso and Dali are like that kind of thing, they keep trying new things and some of their stuff is crap, people who are like Renoir are people like Warhol. That he just basically is just churning out more like Warhols. And I think, you know, if he had lived longer, but even the ones that he did, Basquiat's a little bit like that. I think that Keith Haring's a little bit like that. They did some amazing stuff at the beginning, and then they just started churning out work. And part of this is because, you know, Renoir's at the beginning of this really like booming art market. You know, these weren't like $1 million paintings when he made them. But the market and the idea that you could make money from making art meant that they were often keeping up with the Joneses. So they were just churning them out, partly to keep up their lifestyle. Another artist who's in this category is my least favorite artist in all of existence. Again, somebody who does not know I exist and will never watch this video, but David Salle. I just find his work boring. And why it's boring is the same reason as Julian Schnabel. So David Salle basically puts together he's basically creating a painted collage. And to me, one of the challenges is none of the elements of the painting are done well. You can do good abstraction, you can do good realism, but neither of these is particularly good. And if you're gonna take an artwork into a theoretical vein, it better be freaking good, because if I need more context, I'm gonna need to care enough to read the label. And trust me, I am on this channel all the time telling you context is important. But his context doesn't matter. He's just putting these together for formal reasons. Formal means how it looks. So if that's the case, then it better look frickin' good. And I just don't think he lines up. And this is where I think overrated is really important. Overrated is the idea, to me, that somebody said, hey, your idea and what you made lined up. And in this case, and in the case of Julian Schnabel, and in the case of all the ones that I did in this video, they are basically worth quite a lot of money, millions of dollars sometimes, because of their name. And not because of how much the artist's idea lined up with what they created. And I basically think that these are just unfairly rated by the name of the artist and the kind of cachet they had in the market. So all of these super overrated. But let's talk about artwork that I actually think you might think is overrated that I don't think is overrated. I know that performance art is what people think is the most overrated art. But one, I'd remind you that most performance art isn't actually worth much. You can't sell a performance. Maybe they sell tickets. Maybe they get a fee to perform. Just like any actor. And I would tell you that if you watch any TikTok of anybody doing anything absurd, they probably are making more than a lot of performance artists. So try to take the value monetarily out of it. And a lot of times what they're trying to get you to understand is emotions and feeling and absurdity and things that are just too hard to say into words. But it takes actually being in real life there. It takes actually having the context to understand it. And one of the worst things to me about performance art is seeing it on the internet. It is free and it is wonderful, but it's also basically easy to ape because you don't really get what's happening. You don't really have the experience of being in that space and knowing what it feels like to be with that artist. A lot of times, like Tiffany Rose Haddon, who was doing her MFA with that work, or this Japanese artist who was trying to help you understand movement, and actually Martin Senier, who's doing it here and here to understand movement. It really isn't about deep thoughts. It's about just enjoying how crazy weird this is. And if you watch a lot of TikToks or videos that are just sort of bizarre and absurd, it's actually very similar. And remember, a lot of those bizarre, absurd things on TikTok are making scores and scores of dollars, right? They're making so much from their views. And so if you have no problem with that, you should have no problem with performance. But if you think this is pretentious and those absurd videos you've watched and earned that creator money aren't, it's probably more about you. It's more about you expecting that you're supposed to get something you didn't. And that isn't actually your fault or the artist's fault. It's the fact that you're watching in a video. If you walked into that gallery, they would have handed you a sheet of paper and explained what the hell was going on. So nobody is at fault, and maybe spend some time being like, maybe I'm just not in the right place to see this. So to summarize, there are a lot of artists that I think are overrated. And oftentimes it's an artist who made their name, became a big deal, and then they made a lot more art, and some of it wasn't as good as the first stuff. Either because they tried lots of different things that were super exploratory, and some of those explorations just weren't as interesting. Or they stuck with what they knew and just, wrote it for the money. Either way, lots of their art is overrated. I also think that some people are overrated when they decide to talk a big game and their talk and their artwork don't match up. That said, I don't think you can tell by just looking at the artwork if it's overrated. I think you need to understand the artist and what they're trying to communicate. So a lot of performance art is hard to understand. You assume it's like crap because they're just throwing dirt on a woman, when without the story, without the name of the artist, and without what they're doing, you can't understand. Because you should think of art a little bit like if you were grading an essay. If their point is easy to understand, then it's a good artwork. If their point is not easy to understand, when you have all the information, then it is not a good artwork. And the problem for a lot of contemporary art is when you just see it without the name of the artist, the artwork, and the title, and the information, you don't have all the information. So basically, you cannot judge. And that's really what I'm trying to get at. And this channel and this video is about helping you understand with what you need is more information before you make a decision. It's not that you can't judge what you think is overrated. Just make sure you're judging correctly, with all the information, and then judge away. Be as judgmental as you want about art.